Welcome to the It's in Queens podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Simmons, and this is the only podcast that focuses on my borough of Queens. This podcast comes to you each week thanks to the Queens Tourism Council and the Queens Economic Development Corporation, or QEDC. Together, they promote Queens as a destination filled with wonderful experiences, cultural gems, and opportunities for everyone who lives here, works here, or visits from near or far. One of the defining moments that put Queens on the global stage was the 1964-65 World's Fair, a spectacular event that drew more than 50 million visitors from across the globe to Flushing Meadows Corona Park. It was a showcase of innovation, culture, and global unity, featuring exhibits from more than 80 nations, 24 states, and countless major corporations. And visitors got a glimpse into the future with technology that would later become everyday essentials, including the first public demonstration of computer touchscreens and picture phones. The fair was a celebration of human progress and creativity with dazzling pavilions, futuristic architecture, and awe-inspiring attractions like the iconic Unisphere, which still stands today as a Queens landmark. But beyond the grand exhibits and technological marvels, one of the most extraordinary moments of the fair was the arrival of one of the world's greatest masterpieces, Michelangelo's Pieta. This marked the first and only time the renowned sculptor left the Vatican, a feat orchestrated by two of New York's most influential leaders, Robert Moses and Francis Cardinal Spellman. And as this week's guest, author Ruth D. Nelson, explores in her book, Our Lady of the World's Fair, Moses and Spellman had different motivations for bringing this to Queens. Moses saw it as a major draw to boost the fair's attendance and financial success, while Spellman believed its presence could provide spiritual reassurance to a nation grappling with Cold War anxieties and societal changes. So let's find out more about this remarkable endeavor. Ruth Nelson, welcome to the It's in Queens podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. It's an honor to be here.
Let's start off by talking about you and finding out more about your career and especially how you became an author. So talk a little about your career.
Well, it was not a straight line path. I had actually, after I finished college, I came to New York to do some more studying. I lived in Long Island City. It was a wonderful experience. And eventually I returned to the Chicago area and had various jobs, but I felt a calling to go back to school and get my master's in art history. And my very first class was Italian Renaissance sculpture. And of course, we're studying Michelangelo and the Pietà. And it took me back to when my family went on summer vacation to visit the New York World's Fair. Okay, I'm dating myself here. I was just a small one, but I have these memories of it being magical, just being a magical wonderland. And, you know, I started thinking about, wow, the Pietà was at the New York World's Fair, 1964 to 65. And, you know, I thought, well, that's a story. I wonder how that happened. And so I started researching, and that's how I ended up with Our Lady of the World's Fair, a story of how the Pietà was shipped from St. Peter's Basilica to Flushing Meadows, Queens.
And by the way, we should note you have connections to Queens.
Well,
You're in Long Island City, if I'm correct.
well, yes, absolutely. I had lived in Long Island City. It was a wonderful experience. Those were my younger days, enjoying the New York experience. They're very nice memories. They're wonderful memories.
And what I love about doing this episode is that for people who might have known about the World's Fair, but don't know too much, especially if they're going to visit Flushing Meadows Corona Park, they can pick up the book and learn a lot more about history as well. And know when they're walking through the park about what took place here and everything that was involved in bringing the Pietà to here. So, what inspired you? What was the moment you said, I need to put this into a book? I want people to learn more about this.
Well, being from the Chicago area, I wasn't really familiar with Robert Moses, but I started reading up on him and I thought, wow, he is a fascinating man. And then I also didn't really know about Cardinal Spellman. And I started reading up about him. I thought, wow, here's another fascinating man. And I learned about their cooperation and respect for each other. And it was through that friendship and respect that this whole project was realized of bringing the Pietà over. Moses wanted a blockbuster for the New York World's Fair that would draw in visitors. And so getting the Vatican to agree was the first big hurdle. Would they allow the Pietà to be shipped? And because Cardinal Spellman had done so much work, for example, refugees in Europe after World War II, tremendous efforts to help so many displaced people. He said, well, let this be a thank you. I will loan the Pietà as a thank you to Americans for all of their work during World War II. So that was the first hurdle. So the second, oh, by the way, when the Italians found out that the Pope agreed to send the Pietà over the Atlantic to a fair in Queens, it was like an atom bomb had fallen. And that was the reaction. They were just stunned. That would be the equivalent of, let's say, China asking us to, oh, would you mind, sending us your Statue of Liberty for the fair? It was just so audacious, but it worked. So the second problem was how to ship it. And at this time, the Vatican did have movers because they have a museum and they were accustomed to loaning pieces out to European museums. But the packing, the shipping and the packing of their museum items had not changed much from the time of Napoleon. So Spellman had put together an American team, and they learned, oh no, we need to do something better. Wrapping it in linen and filling the crate with wood shavings, it was not going to cut it. Not considering the value of Michelangelo's Pietà. So this was the dawn of styrofoam. So they used styrofoam chips, like those stuffed peanuts, to fill the crate. And then the crate was put into another crate. And then that was also filled with styrofoam chips. And that protected and kept the sculpture secure. And they had done test runs with before this, testing the styrofoam. And although they didn't do it with the original, there was a replica that they would even test drop the crate to see how it would hold up. So because they use styrofoam, well, let me back up for a second. The second big question was, how are we going to ship it? By air, by ship, or maybe by submarine that was floated. But eventually they decided to ship it. And they had secured it on the deck of an Italian ship called Christopher Columbus. And here's the great thing, because it was packed with styrofoam, even if the ship sank, the crate would float.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they also had a little, it wired electronically, so they were always aware of what was going on with the crate on deck.
So you're mentioning some of the challenges. What was the most, what was something fascinating that you learned along the way that you would love for readers to discover for themselves? So we don't want to reveal everything because we want people to
That's
read the
right.
book.
That's right. Well, there were so many new discoveries, but one really fun one was the role of Joe Mielziner. For a lot of theater fans out there, they will uh, maybe recognize the name because in the 60s, he was the number 1 set designer for Broadway and for the whole theater scene. And he decided, well, he was a convert to the Catholic Church. Um, he was Jewish. He was not a practice. He wasn't practicing, but more cultural. But he had converted and he volunteered to set the stage for the Pietà inside the Vatican Pavilion at the fair. And many people were expecting him to recreate the Baroque chapel in which the Pietà is installed at St. Peter's. But he was so creative and so ahead of his time that he decided, no, I want a contemporary background. So that's what he did. And there were Italians who came to the pavilion and said they actually liked the presentation at the pavilion better than the presentation at St. Peter's. It was,
Wow.
yes, yes. Well, it turns out that Mielziner received a lot of criticism from the press. And it was really a shame because the public loved it. The critics, not so much.
We find that with a lot of Broadway shows often that, they get such a good response from people and yet the critics might pan it. So, you can always believe the critics.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So talk a little about the significance of the Pope's visit to New York in
Oh,
1965.
oh yeah. Well, let me back up for a second and talk a little bit about the pavilion because it's related. The pavilion had something for everybody. So actually, the most popular pavilion at the World's Fair was GM's Futurama, and it had 29 million visitors. But the second most popular was the Vatican Pavilion, and they had 27 million visitors. And they had a chapel inside. They had some wonderful exhibits. They brought in contemporary art, but it was a gift shop. It was the gift shop that made such a profit. Yeah, the World's Fair actually lost money, but the Vatican Pavilion gift shop made money, and they made enough money to finance the first trip of any pope to the Western Hemisphere. And it was just for a day. It initially, the Vatican said, no, 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 the Pope is not coming to America for the fair. No, no, he's here to address United Nations. He received the invitation. But Robert Moses was not going to let this opportunity slip through his hands. So he worked with Spellman to, before the Pope got to JFK Airport, they would swing over to the fairgrounds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was like at 9 o'clock at night, and the plane was heading out at 10:30, something like that. But Robert Moses was given instructions that this was to be very low key. The Pope was to enter through a side gate, and it's going to be very quick, 15-minute visit in and out. Well, uh, I'm not sure how he did it, but he had instructed the chauffeur for the Pope Mobile to not use the side gate, but go through the main entrance. So when the Pope, his car entered the main entrance, he was greeted by fireworks, by marching band, by thousands of visitors, and also the press. So Moses was able to milk the visit all for all it's worth, because he could see at this point, the second year, that the fair was not going to make the profit he thought, but this would surely give a boost to the fair, and it did.
So I assume that the Pieta's visit to New York affected or changed the relationship between the Catholic Church and the art world.
Well, well, that's a really interesting question, because I wouldn't say the Pietà so much, because the church had already really embraced the art of the Renaissance. However, in the pavilion, there are a lot of artistic innovations on display for contemporary art. And that was what really started trends to bring in contemporary art into the Catholic Church. And that was very successful.
What was the lasting legacy of the Pieta's visit to the World's Fair?
Well, I think the legacy is that an entire generation of baby boomers who visited the fair as children learn about the Pietà and Michelangelo's work. So this is the funny thing. You just take it for granted. And I was telling a coworker who was in her 20s, and she was an art major. She asked me what I was working on when I was writing my book, and I said, "Oh, well, you know Michelangelo's Pietà?" And she said, "No." So I realized that we had it was like a privilege to have learned, possibly have seen the Pietà, because it really was an art history lesson for us. But for younger generations, they may not be getting that. So that legacy might be fading a little bit. We got to work on that.
Well, that's where your book comes in. And in fact, that brings me to one of my final questions, which is anyone who reads Our Lady of the World's Fair, what do you want them to take away from this? Because it's informative. I would expect it's going to be entertaining at parts, but what do you hope the readers will take away?
Uh, I think the the number one thing is that world fairs, and they're still out there, are really worthwhile events. Even in this digital era, world fairs are a wonderful experience, and they're still going on. China has taken the lead in hosting and participation in world fairs, and we need to bring that back.
Well,
We need to
we need to have another one in Queens.
bingo.
Talk a little about the feedback you've gotten since publishing the book and what you've heard from readers.
Yes, I have heard, since the book came out, I've heard some beautiful stories. And one of them was from an Italian immigrant couple that came over on the boat, the Christopher Columbus, on that same passage as the Pietà. And among the Italians, and this is something I never would have picked up in a newspaper or in the archives, among the Italians on that boat, they were told, if the ship sinks, hold on to Mary. So it's, yes, the crate would float, but also symbolically, it's very beautiful.
Before I let you go, Ruth, please let our listeners know where they can go if they'd like to get a copy of Our Lady of the World's Fair and to learn more about you.
Well, I do have a website. It's Ruth D. Nelson, all one word.com. And I have a little background information there, as well as a link to Cornell University Press that published the book. But the book is also available on Amazon. So I hope that your listeners might have an interest.
Well, Ruth Nelson, I want to thank you so much for sharing this story, and I encourage our listeners to please get a copy of Our Lady of the World's Fair. Thanks so much for joining us here on the It's in Queens. Today, you can still see remnants of that historic event in Flushing Meadows Corona Park, one of the most dynamic and diverse public spaces in New York City. Whether you're admiring the iconic Unisphere, exploring the New York State Pavilion, or enjoying the Queens Museum's permanent collection featuring a detailed model of New York City, the park remains a hub of activity and a testament to Queens' rich history. You can also catch a match at the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center, home of the US Open, as we all know, or visit the New York Hall of Science, which continues to inspire with interactive exhibits. And of course, this is also where Queens Theater is located. And there's also the nearby Queens Botanical Garden, which offers a peaceful retreat with lush gardens and sustainable landscapes, with Meadow Lake providing space for kayaking, biking, and picnicking, making it a perfect destination for families and outdoor enthusiasts alike. And the Botanical Garden is a little further away, but you should definitely make a point of visiting it as well. Now, speaking of visitation, if you're looking for a place to visit in Queens during the winter months, well, we always have you covered here because there's lots of activities that are going on. But how do you find out about them? Well, we've got the answer. That is where Rob Mackay comes in. He's with the Queens Economic Development Corporation and the Queens Tourism Council. And each and every week on this podcast, he brings us the highlights of some of the more exciting events that are happening in Queens. Here's this week's report.
Hi, Jeff. Well, again, we've got a great week, but again, I've got a great choice. It's the Colonial Culinary Series at the Queens County Farm Museum. It starts this February 22nd, and it continues periodically until November 8th. It's a chance to basically do kind of like workshops where you experience history through taste, where you're actually making foods and eating foods, but all the kind of stuff that we ate here in New York a couple of 100 years ago. There's going to be, they're all together. There are 10 sessions, and they'll be on such topics as West African food or the influence that enslaved people had on the American culinary scene. There'll be something on stews and soups, on spices, herb butter, cakes, custard, and of course, apples. So it's one of those things where you get to learn and you get to eat what you learn. And again, it's at the Queens County Farm Museum out in Floral Park. All right, Jeff. Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Why, thank you, Rob. That is just a few of the things that are happening in our borough. And the place to go to discover and explore everything that's on the horizon is at the It's in Queens website. And that website address, which is so easy to remember, it'sinqueens.com. And by the way, if you're interested in learning about businesses in Queens, like how to help your business or a friend's business, well, head right over to the Queens Economic Development Corporation's website. And that website, queensny.org. And by the way, when you're there, or when you visit the It's in Queens website, sign up for their newsletters. And that way you get notified right in your inbox about opportunities. And when you visit any place in Queens, say you're visiting the park, you're seeing the Unisphere, snap some photos and make sure to share them with us. And here's how it'll be put on our radar. You just need to use the hashtag #It'sInQueens when you're posting on Instagram or X. And then maybe your photo could become our photo of the week. Well, that's it for this week's report. I'm your host, Jeff Simmons, and I'll see you next week on the It's in Queens podcast.